Well, indoor surveillance is just one piece of this story. It stretches far beyond the items in our homes. It can really impact you in nearly any public setting, in public places, on the roads, at intersections, nearly everywhere. Cameras are tracking you. NewsNation's Brooke Schaefer joins us live. And Brooke, who actually has access to these types of cameras?
Well, police have access to some of these cameras. Actually talked to a cybersecurity expert. He said that pretty much it's a fact of life now in 2022. You walk outside, you should expect to be on camera somewhere. In fact, he told me that there are hundreds of thousands of cameras across the U.S. that police have access to.
Walk outside and chances are you'll spot one of these. A security camera, keeping an eye on you and everyone around you. There are hundreds of thousands of them across the country. In fact, the group Comparatech found law enforcement have access to nearly 270,000 cameras, monitoring roughly 44.2 million people in the U.S. Comparatech said that's on average about 6 cameras per 1,000 people.
We're talking about traffic cameras, cameras installed on public transportation, on roadways. Sometimes these may include private cameras on private property if police have access to those.
Paul Bischoff is a consumer privacy expert and an editor at Comparatech. His group found Atlanta is the most highly surveilled city in the U.S., with about 49 cameras per 1,000 people.
Obviously, they help to solve certain crimes. And on a darker note, the other side of the coin is that cameras can be used to control people. They can inhibit people's freedom of movement, for example. People act differently when they know they're being watched.
But for some perspective, when it comes to the most surveilled cities in the world, excluding China, number 1 is Delhi, India, with more than 1,000 cameras per square mile. New York has way less than that, with roughly 187 cameras per square mile. But Bischoff said more and more often, these cameras have face recognition technology. And he says that's not something to take lightly.
So not only are they seeing, some person moving around who could be later identified, they can be identified in real time.
All right, so what can you do here? Unfortunately, there's not really a whole lot you can do. Again, as time goes by, technology gets better. There are cameras everywhere. And again, those numbers you just heard, the cameras that police have access to, that doesn't include other cameras that police don't have access to. And it doesn't include, maybe more importantly, the cameras on people's cell phones nowadays. Again, Nichole, there are cameras everywhere.
Everywhere. All right. Brooke Schaefer, thank you for that. Well, continuing this conversation now with surveillance and privacy policy analyst Matthew Guarglia. Matthew, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
All right, so we just heard a report there from Markey. We heard Brooks' report. Is it safe to say Big Brother is really always watching us?
Absolutely. And when it comes to the division between government surveillance and private surveillance done by consumer electronic devices, that boundary is getting eroded every single day. So it's safe to assume to some extent that anything devices collect on you and are being held by private companies can in some way or another be gotten by the government. And so those boundaries are really being eroded by the second.
So, Matthew, you mentioned government surveillance there. I want to hone in on that. The Patriot Act, Section 702, it allows the government to track non-U.S. citizens based outside of the country. It was passed back in 2008, set to be renewed next year. But there's been examples in the past where the sweeping searches really do impact privacy of Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. They have this thing called incidental collection, which means that, if people are talking to people overseas, or if you're talking to somebody who talks overseas, then as part of this large mass surveillance effort to sweep up all of that data, it's also sweeping up a fair amount of data of Americans as well. And all of that is just sitting somewhere and is sitting in a big pool, which law enforcement and with intelligence agencies are dying to get access to and have increasing access to over the years. So even though these are supposed to be for national security purposes, watching people abroad, a surprising amount of Americans have their data being swept up by these massive national security surveillance efforts.
All right, so let's keep talking about that. So you say all of that data is collected and it's sitting somewhere. So what rights do Americans have in that type of situation?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there is so really little regulation around what type of data is being collected and for how long and for what reasons. And even when it is unlawful, for instance, for an agency to be sweeping up the data of Americans along with people abroad. That hasn't historically really stopped these agencies from doing that. In fact, a lot of these agencies have been found over time to be in violation of those laws. And it really only takes an act of Congress and some real strong privacy regulations in order to try to get them in check.
All right, so maybe asking for forgiveness versus asking for permission. Matthew, I want to talk about road cameras, particularly here in Chicago. We have speed cameras, we have red light cameras. Some areas there are toll booth cameras. Who is able to access this information? And are those cameras possibly recording more than we think?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, every town seems to have their own regulations on what is collected and, importantly, how long it's collected for. So, for instance, a lot of these towns have automated license plate readers, and they have a hot list of cars they're looking for because they might be stolen or because they might be associated with some kind of crime investigation. And in some towns, if you drive through that red light camera and that automated license plate reader, and you're not one of those hot listed cars, immediately the data is erased. So there is less of a record of where you go all the time. But in some towns, every single automated license plate reader you drive past records what time you were there, records the location of your license plate. And so it really is possible to use all of that data and see where somebody has traveled in a single day, everywhere they've gone. And it's a huge invasion of privacy.
Yeah, someone is always watching. Matthew Berlie, thank you so much. Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.